The morning came in sideways the way Kansas mornings did in November. Not with light so much as with a slow withdrawal of darkness. The sky turning from black to the color of old pewter. The wind already moving across the flats before Willa Greer had laced her boots. She stood at the single window that faced east, the glass fogged at its corners from the warmth inside, and looked at what the night had done to her woodpile. The canvas she'd weighted down with stones had shifted. One corner had pulled free, and the snow that fell after midnight wet, heavy the kind that clung to everything it touched, had worked its way under the edge and settled across the top third of the stacked wood. She didn't curse. She didn't press her forehead to the glass. She simply looked at it the way a person looks at a wound they already knew was coming, measuring it, calculating what it meant. It meant trouble. Not immediately, not today. But the math of a Kansas winter was unforgiving, and Willa had been doing that math since March. She pulled on her coat before the children woke. The coat had been Hank's too large across the shoulders, the cuffs turned back twice, the wool worn smooth at the elbows from years of fence work and harvest labor. She'd meant to take it in before winter, but hadn't gotten around to it, and now she wore it the way she wore most things that had been his without sentiment, because sentiment was a luxury that burned no wood and split no kindling. She stepped outside into a cold so complete it had texture pressing against her face like a hand, and walked to the woodpile. Willa Greer was 33 years old, though she looked neither older nor younger than that number in any simple way. Her hair was dark brown, almost black in low light, worn pulled back and pinned without ceremony. Not vanity's opposite so much as the absence of time for vanity. Her shoulders were broader than a woman of her frame might be expected to carry, built that way by 5 years of work that didn't care about expectations. Her hands had the particular roughness of palms that had learned the difference between a splitting maul and a draw knife by feel rather than instruction. The skin across her knuckles calloused in the specific pattern of someone who gripped things hard and often. Her eyes were blue-gray, the color of a Kansas sky in February, and they had a quality of looking that people noticed without always being able to name the quality of a person who observed before she concluded, who let information complete itself before she acted on it. She'd been a school teacher before she was a homesteader's wife. 3 years in a one-room school in Barton County, teaching arithmetic and reading to children who ranged from 6 to 15, learning in that time that the most useful thing she could give any of them was not a fact, but a method, a way of approaching a problem that would outlast the specific answer. She'd married Hank Greer in the spring of 1881 and come west with him to the 47 acres on the Flint table, and she'd traded the schoolroom for the prairie without regret, because the prairie turned out to require everything the schoolroom had taught her and more. She pulled back the canvas at the woodpile. Underneath, the top layer was wet through. She pressed her palm against the wood and felt the surface moisture, then worked her fingers along the grain to find where the water had traveled. Deeper than she'd hoped. The logs at the very bottom of the stack, the ones she'd cut and split in September, when the air was still dry enough to matter, those were fine. But everything above the third row had taken on water during the freeze-thaw cycles of the past 2 weeks, and wet wood in a land where fire was the difference between a living child and a dead one was not a minor inconvenience. It was a catastrophe waiting for the right night to arrive. She restacked the canvas, weighted it better, and stood in the gray morning, with her breath making small clouds in front of her face. The wind moved across the Flint table without apology, as it always did. There were no trees to slow it, no hills to redirect it, nothing between this 47 acres and the open throat of the Northwest. In summer, that wind was a nuisance. In January, it was a killer that never announced itself. Willa knew what killed her husband. That was the thing she carried that nobody else did, the knowledge she'd turned over in her hands every day since March, like a stone she couldn't put down. Hank had died in a blizzard that came late in the season, the kind of storm that caught people half unprepared, because February had been mild and people had stopped paying attention the way you stop paying attention to a dog that had been quiet too long. He'd gone out twice to bring in wood from the pile, and both times the wood was too wet to catch properly. It smoldered. Through smoke gave almost no heat. He'd burned through twice what he should have, trying to coax flame from wood that wasn't ready. And when the pile ran low, he went out again into a wind that was sitting at 30 below with the gusts, and he didn't come back strong. He came back wrong. She'd found him at the door, barely inside, one boot off, like he'd been trying to strip down before the cold took him all the way. He lived another 4 days after that, the fever climbing in a way that had no ceiling, and then he stopped. The doctor from Caldwell who came out afterward said it was exposure complicated by pneumonia, wrote something in his ledger, collected his fee. What the ledger didn't say was that Hank Greer had burned wet wood all night, and it had killed him just as surely as a bullet would have, only slower and without the mercy of being quick. Willa had not told anyone this. Not Roy Calder, not the women at the church gathering in Maplewood, not even her mother in the letter she'd written in April, when the ground thawed enough to feel like the world was still turning. She'd written that Hank died in the storm. That was true. She'd left out the rest because the rest contained something she wasn't ready to give away, the particular specific knowledge of exactly how a person dies when their firewood is wet in January, and the understanding that if she didn't solve that problem before this winter, she might be writing the same letter about herself, except there would be no one left to write it. She went back inside and started the morning fire. The wood she used came from the dry stack she kept near the stove, a 3-day supply. She rotated carefully, bringing wood in from outside early enough for it to dry further in the warmth of the house before burning. It was a system Hank had never bothered with. It was a system she'd invented the week after she buried him, sitting alone in this house with 2 sleeping children, and the particular clarity that comes to a person when they have burned away everything that isn't essential. The fire caught. Dex came down from the loft first, as he always did, his hair pressed flat on one side, from sleep, wearing his father's old wool sweater that now fit him almost correctly at 10 years old. He sat near the stove without being told, which was one of the things about Dex that made her throat tighten sometimes, the way he'd step quietly and without drama into a seriousness he shouldn't have needed yet. Louisa came second slower, dragging a blanket she refused to leave upstairs until full daylight. At 7, she was still permitted to be a child about some things. Willa made corn porridge and didn't speak about the woodpile. There was no purpose in saying it out loud before she had something to say along with it. Roy Calder arrived mid-morning, which was his habit on days when the weather gave any kind of pause. He was a widower himself, had been for 3 years living alone in the 2-room house he'd built on his claim 2 miles west of the Greer property. He'd taken it upon himself in a quiet, unannounced way to check on the Greer place roughly twice a week since Hank died, showing up, doing what needed doing, without being asked, drinking coffee if it was offered, leaving without ceremony. Willa respected that about him. He didn't require her gratitude. He didn't perform concern. He was practical in the way that 11 years on the flint table made a person practical, which meant he saw problems clearly and stated them without decoration. He stood at the woodpile for a long moment after she'd shown him what happened with the canvas. He pressed his hand into the top layer the same way she had, working his fingers along the grain, lifting a piece and feeling its weight. Roy Calder was not a tall man, but he was a solid one. The kind of solid that came from decades of physical work rather than from any particular size. His face was the face of a man who had spent 20 years looking at horizons, the skin weathered to a permanent creased attention, the eyes the particular shade of brown that looked darker than it was because of the contrast with the sun-bleached lines around it. His voice was flat, not unkind. "Willa, you're not going to make it through January with this. Even if it dried out today, which it won't, you don't have enough volume. I know that. The bottom rows are fine, but you'd burn through those before February. I know that too." He looked at her, then the way people looked at her when they expected her to ask for something. She didn't. She was looking at the pile again, at the angle of the snow that had come in under the canvas, at the lay of the ground beneath the stack, at the slight rise of the earth on the south side of the house, where the sod foundation met the soil. She was thinking something. He could see that she was thinking something. He had the good sense not to interrupt it. "I'll figure it out," she said, not defensively, just as a statement of fact, the way she might say the sun would come up. Roy left an hour later, and Willa sat at the table with a piece of paper she'd taken from the drawer where she kept Dex's school supplies. She didn't write anything on it for a long time. She just let the problem sit in front of her the way a math problem sits, with all its elements visible, waiting to be arranged into something that resolved. The problem had a shape. The shape was this: firewood to burn correctly needed to be dry. To stay dry in a Kansas winter, firewood needed to be protected from snow, from rain, from the freeze-thaw cycle, that wicked moisture into the grain of the wood, even through canvas covers and board sheds. The above-ground solutions she'd tried and seen others try: canvas weighted with stones, open sheds with angled roofs, wood stacked under the eave of the house, all of them shared the same flaw. They were fighting the weather. They were trying to keep the cold and wet out of a space that the cold and wet were designed to enter. She thought about the well digger. His name had been Amos Pruitt, and he'd come out the previous spring to assess the Greer property's water table talking, while he worked in the way men did when they expected no one was really listening. He'd said almost as an aside that below 6 feet, the earth held a different character. The frost couldn't reach it. The temperature down there stayed stable year-round, somewhere around 50 degrees cold enough to preserve warm enough to prevent freezing. He'd said it like a fact about weather, unremarkable the way people stated things they'd always known. She'd filed it away without knowing she was filing it away. Now she pulled it out. If the earth below 6 feet didn't freeze, then the earth below 6 feet didn't allow wood to freeze either. It didn't allow moisture to accumulate the way it did above ground during a storm. It didn't allow the surface temperature swings that cracked bark, open grain, let water travel into wood that had already been dried. A space below 6 feet was by definition a stable space. Not warm, but stable. Dry in the way that mattered. She wrote nothing on the paper. She folded it and put it back in the drawer. Then she went outside, found the iron rod she used for testing soil compaction, and began pressing it into the ground at different points around the south side of the house. She pressed it in 2 feet. She pressed it in 4. She noted where it met resistance, the frost line, which was currently sitting at about 3.5 feet given the mild November. She moved to the south-facing side of the foundation, where the slight rise of the land created a natural overhang. Here the frost line was shallower because the house itself had been holding some ground temperature on this side. She did this for 3 mornings. She brought out the same rod, the same methodical pressure noted the resistance at different depths. On the 3rd morning, she also brought a small pail of water and poured a careful amount at different depths she'd pre-dug with a spade, watching how quickly it froze or didn't freeze, how the soil absorbed it at different levels. Dex watched her from the doorway on the 2nd morning, wrapped in his coat, not asking. On the 4th morning, she got the bigger spade. She began in the corner of the main room where the floor joist ran closest to the south-facing foundation wall. The floor of the sod house was hard-packed earth laid over with rough board salvage planking Hank had brought from Caldwell on the wagon the first year, cut and fitted in sections. She lifted one section of planking and set it aside. Beneath it was the packed earth floor. She began to dig. The children were at the Maplewood School that day, the one-room building that met 3 days a week, when weather permitted 1.5 miles across the grass, and Willa worked in their absence with the focused silence she recognized in herself from other impossible tasks. She dug the same way she'd learned to do most things on this land, without hurrying, without stopping, with the particular economy of motion that came from understanding. She had only so much energy, and the work had only so many requirements, and the meeting of those 2 things was all that was being asked of her. By the time she collected the children from school, she had a hole 4 feet across and 3 feet deep in a pile of excavated earth stacked at the back of the house, where it would serve as additional insulation along the north wall. She replaced the planking over the hole and said nothing about it at supper. She worked for 2 weeks this way, mornings when the children were occupied, evenings after they slept. The hole became a room 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, 7 feet deep. She shored the ceiling with timber she'd pulled from the skeleton of an abandoned claim 3 miles east, the remnants of a barn that had never been finished, the wood dry and sound despite its weathering. She fitted the beams with the care of someone who understood that a collapsed ceiling was not a setback but an ending. She didn't rush the bracing. She measured it, leveled it, wedged it, tested it with her own weight before she trusted it to anything else. She cut a ventilation shaft at an angle through the south wall of the house, emerging just above ground level outside, screened with a piece of scrap tin she punctured with a nail in a grid of small holes. Air moved through it. She could feel it when she held her hand over the opening inside the chamber, a faint, steady draw, not enough to cause a chill, enough to ensure the air down there wouldn't stagnate. The access was a trap door she cut into the planking, 18 inches by 24. Fitted with leather hinges she'd sewn herself, weighted so it fell closed, but opened with one hand. A short tunnel angled downward from the trap door to the floor of the chamber, not vertical, which would require a ladder in both hands, but sloped at an angle she'd calculated would allow a person to descend carrying an armload of wood. It looked from inside the house like a dark mouth in the corner of the floor. Dex saw it on the morning she finally left the planking open. He stood at the edge, looking down into the tunnel, and his face held the particular expression of a 10-year-old confronting something he didn't have a category for yet. His voice was careful, feeling out the words, Mama, you going down to hell? Willa was coiling the last of the rope she'd used to lower timber into the chamber. She didn't look up. No, I'm digging so you don't have to. He sat on the edge of the trapdoor opening and looked down for a long time. Then, can I go in? When I say it's ready. He accepted this without argument. That was Dex at 10, the acceptance without argument, which was either wisdom beyond his years or trust beyond what she'd earned, and she couldn't always tell which. She carried the first load of firewood down 3 days later. 12 pieces of split oak she'd selected from the dry bottom rows of the outside pile, each piece already well seasoned. She stacked them against the far wall of the chamber on 2 parallel lengths of timber she'd laid as a raised floor, keeping the wood off the bare earth by 4 inches. She stood in the chamber after she'd stacked it, listening to the particular quality of silence underground, feeling the temperature on her face and arms. It was noticeably different from above, not warm but possessing a stability that the surface world in November had entirely abandoned. The difference between 52 degrees and 11 was not a small difference. It was the difference between water that moved and water that didn't. She let Dex descend the following week. He went down with the lamp held carefully in both hands, made it to the chamber floor, straightened up, turned slowly. In the underground quiet, his voice had a different quality, more contained, less boyish. It's warmer than upstairs. Not warmer, less cold. He pressed his palm flat against the earth wall. He looked at the stacked wood. He looked at the ceiling beams with the evaluating eye she'd been watching develop in him since he was small, the eye that wanted to understand not just what a thing did, but why it did it. The ground is holding the temperature, he said, not a question. The ground below the frost line holds a stable temperature regardless of what the air above it does. Amos Pruitt explained it to your father when he was out assessing the well. The earth stops taking orders from the weather at a certain depth. He turned this over, she let him. A week later, when she was adjusting the angle of the ventilation shaft's interior screen, he appeared at her elbow without being summoned and held the screen in place while she drove the pin that fixed it. His small hands steady, not asking what to do. Just doing the thing that was clearly needed. She didn't comment on it. She moved to the next task and he followed, and they worked in the underground room for 40 minutes without speaking, which was, in its own way, a complete conversation. She began moving the best of her dry wood into the chamber over the following week, carrying it down an armload, stacking it with the same care she'd used on the bracing. She brought down roughly a third of her total supply. The rest she left outside because the chamber had its limits, and she was too careful a person to allow herself to believe she'd solved everything with one solution. Roy Calder came on a Tuesday in early December, and he saw the trapdoor. He looked at it for a moment without saying anything, the way a person looks at something that doesn't fit the pattern of the room. Then he looked at her, and she could read the question in his face before he asked it. What is that storage? Roy set his coffee down and walked to the trapdoor and crouched beside it. He lifted the leather hinge, let it fall. He looked at the angle of the tunnel below. He put his hand into the opening and held it there, feeling the air. He was quiet for a long time. That ceiling going to hold... I tested it with my own weight before I stored anything down there. Earth walls. Packed hard, I haven't seen any crumbling. Ventilation. She showed him the interior opening of the shaft. He put his hand over it and felt the draw. He nodded once, not in agreement necessarily, but in the way of a man filing new information. He stood up. It's going to be cold down there. It's 52 degrees. I haven't got a thermometer, but that's my estimate from feel. Nothing's frozen, nothing's accumulated frost. Roy was quiet for a moment. That's warmer than I'd expect. That's what the earth does below the frost line. Amos Pruitt told Hank that when he was out assessing the well. The ground holds steady down there. He picked up his coffee and drank from it, looking at the trap door over the rim of the cup. His face was difficult to read, which was true of Roy Calder's face in most situations. He was a man who processed things internally before he committed to a position, and she respected that even when it was frustrating. I'm not saying it won't work. I know you're not. I'm saying I'd want to know more before I said it would. That's fair. He left without giving her a verdict. She didn't need his verdict. She needed to keep filling the chamber. What Roy didn't tell her was what he did the following afternoon. He went home, found a length of scrap timber and a spade, and dug a hole in the packed earth beside his barn 2 feet across, 2 feet deep. Nothing that declared itself to anyone who might pass by. He packed the walls smooth, cut a small timber lid from a board he'd pulled off a broken crate placed inside it. 3 pieces of split cottonwood he'd been keeping dry in the house. He lidded it. He covered it with loose dirt so it blended into the ground near the barn wall. He wrote the date in the small notebook he kept for recording weather and livestock conditions. That evening, he sat in his chair by the stove and looked at the framed photograph on the mantel. His wife Margaret, taken the year before she died, her expression carrying the particular warmth of a woman who had found her life exactly where she'd chosen to build it. Roy had conversations with that photograph, the way some men talk to themselves without embarrassment, because Margaret had always been the person he thought alongside, and her absence hadn't changed the need for the thinking. He looked at her now. That Greer woman is doing something peculiar with her floor. I can't tell yet if it's brilliant or dangerous. He poured his coffee. Probably both, that's usually how those go. 20 days later, on a morning when the overnight temperature had dropped to 8 degrees and his outdoor woodpile had developed the surface crackling of serious frost. Penetration, he uncovered the hole beside his barn and removed the cottonwood. He held each piece in both hands. He ran his thumb along the grain. He set them against pieces he pulled from the outdoor pile and held them side by side in the same gray morning light. The wood from the hole was dry. Not warm, not dramatically different to look at, but dry through the grain, dry at the core, not carrying the weight of absorbed moisture that the outdoor pieces carried, not cracking at the ends with the shallow splits that meant the outside was frozen around a wet interior. He burned both pieces that evening side by side in the same fire and watched the difference. The cottonwood from the hole caught faster, held longer, burned cleaner. The outdoor piece smoldered for 6 minutes before it caught properly. Through smoke, gave uneven heat. He wrote in his notebook, right about the temperature. Wrong to say nothing about it sooner. He looked at the initials he'd written, changed his mind, crossed them out, wrote W. Greer instead. She deserved the full name. He covered the hole back up and said nothing. He was not yet certain enough to say something which was his way, certainty first, statement after. Silas Breck arrived at the Greer property on a Thursday, and his arrival had the quality of a man who had come for a professional purpose rather than a neighborly one. Breck was the closest thing the Flint table had to a builder of record he'd constructed or supervised the construction of nearly every significant structure within 30 miles, and his opinion about load-bearing capacity and structural common sense carried the weight that came from being right more often than wrong over a long period of time. People deferred to Breck on matters of building, the way they deferred to the doctor on matters of fever. His opinion was not just one man's view, it was a verdict. He'd been sent, Willa understood, without it being said, by someone connected to Hank's family. There had been a letter in November from a lawyer named Aldrich in Caldwell, representing the interests of Hank's brother Warren, suggesting that the property's management was a matter of some concern, and that someone with professional standing should assess the condition of the improvements. Breck was doing that now, moving through the main room with professional deliberateness, pressing his thumb into the sod walls, examining the roof joists, checking the window frames for moisture damage. When he found the trapdoor, he stopped. He looked at it for a longer moment than Roy had. Then he looked at Willa with an expression that was not quite accusatory, but was certainly evaluative. He descended without asking permission, not out of rudeness exactly, but out of the certainty that his professional eye was a kind of authority that didn't require invitation. He was down there for 5 minutes. She could hear him moving, testing the ceiling beams with his hands pressing against the earth walls and sections. When he came back up, his knees were dusty from the tunnel floor, and his expression had settled into something she recognized as the face of a man who had decided his conclusion before he went down and had found enough to confirm it below. He stood up and looked at her with the particular directness of a man who considered plain speech a professional courtesy. Mrs. Greer, I need to tell you professionally and plainly that what you've built down there is a hazard. She waited. Those earth walls need to be sealed or they'll begin to crumble when the temperature starts cycling in spring. That timber you've used for the ceiling, I recognize it from the Kendrick claim. It's been weathering unprotected for 2 years. It's going to take on moisture from below and rot out inside of 18 months, maybe less. You'll lose the ceiling. He paused. And the cold air. Cold air sinks. You're building a cold trap beneath your house. Whatever heat you're trying to preserve above ground is going to bleed downward into that chamber, and you'll end up with a house that's colder than it would have been without it. Willa listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue with his physics, because arguing with Silas Breck's physics in front of an audience Roy Calder was visible through the window. Splitting wood near the fence was not a battle that served her purposes. When he finished, she said, "I appreciate you coming out. Can I offer you coffee before you go?" He seemed briefly wrong-footed by the absence of defense or explanation. He declined the coffee, made a note in the small ledger he carried, and left. He walked past Roy on his way to his horse. Roy straightened up from the splitting and watched Breck's face, and something passed between the two men that was not conversation, but was not nothing either. Roy came back inside. He stood near the stove. He's going to talk. He already has in his own way. She was back at the table with her ledger, making note of the wood count in the chamber. It doesn't change anything. Breck did talk. By the second week of December, everyone within the loose radius of community that constituted the Flint Table District knew that the Greer widow had dug a hole in her floor. The story traveled at the speed of necessity and boredom, which in that sparse geography was faster than people admitted. She was at the Hearst store on a Wednesday, buying lamp oil and a small amount of salt pork. Mabel Hearst ran the counter with her husband's name on the deed, and her own organizational intelligence running everything behind it. A woman who understood that a store in an isolated community was a social institution as much as a commercial one, and who used that understanding with the precision of a person who has identified her leverage and decided to apply it consistently. There were 6 people in the store when Willa arrived. Mabel was in the middle of a sentence, and she did not lower her voice when she saw who had entered. "And she's got the children climbing down into it, teaching the girl to use a rope. It's not right." A deliberate pause, time for effect. Children living like prairie dogs. Some women, when they lose their footing, they just keep digging. The store went quiet in the particular way of a room waiting to see what would happen next. Willa moved to the counter and placed her list on the wood surface without looking at Mabel directly. "I'll take a pound of the salt pork and a half-gallon of oil, please." Her voice had no edge to it, no performance of dignity, no suppressed anger visible at the surface. She was simply a customer with a list standing at a counter waiting to be served. Mabel served her, the transaction completed. Willa paid, took her wrapped parcels, and set on her way out, not to Mabel, specifically to the room, in the particular way that makes a statement land everywhere at once. "Thank you, Mabel." She was in the wagon and moving before the door of the store had stopped swinging. She did not replay what had been said. She had 2 children and a winter to get through, and the energy required to hold on to someone else's contempt was energy that belonged to the problem in the corner of her floor. What she didn't see was Roy Calder, who had been in the back of the store looking at harness hardware when she walked in. He'd heard the whole exchange. He'd watched Willa's back as she stood at the counter, the set of her shoulders, the absolute stillness of a woman choosing not to combust. He'd watched her leave. He put down the harness ring he'd been examining and walked out without buying anything. The letter from the Caldwell lawyer arrived at Willa's door on December 19th, brought by a writer from town who asked no questions and waited for no response. The language was formal, measured, clear in its purpose, without saying anything that could be construed as an outright threat. Warren Greer had engaged Aldrich and Croft to look into the matter of the Greer property deed. Given the circumstances of the current management, a single woman, 2 minor children, no male co-signer on the original land claim, there might be grounds for a formal review of the deed's terms under Kansas statutes governing homestead succession. They would be in touch. They remained her humble servants. She read it twice. She folded it and placed it in the drawer with Dex's school paper. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table, feeling the grain of the wood under her palms. Then she got up and went to the trap door and descended into the chamber. She stood in the cool, still air of the underground room and looked at the stacked wood against the far wall. 14 days' worth of fuel at careful use, maybe 12 at heavy burning if the temperature dropped hard. She had built this room in 6 weeks with a spade, salvaged timber, a tin punch, and the decision to take a well-digger's throwaway comment seriously. She had spent $11 in materials. She had spent approximately 40 hours of labor worked in the margins of days that were already full. Warren Greer's lawyer charged by the hour. The arithmetic of who had more resources to sustain a long conflict was not flattering to her. But the arithmetic of who had more reason to fight it was not flattering to Warren Greer. She came back up through the tunnel, lowered the trap door, put on her coat, went outside to split wood. She worked for 2 hours the mall, moving in the rhythm she'd found that kept her back straight and used her body weight rather than her arm strength. That evening after supper, Dex did his sums at the table, and Louisa drew something on the back of a flour sack with charcoal from the fire. Willa sat in Hank's chair, which she'd moved closer to the stove than he'd ever kept it, because she ran colder than he did, and she looked at the trap door in the corner of the room. It didn't look like salvation. It looked like a hole in the floor, which was what it was. Salvation was not a dramatic-looking thing in her experience. It looked like work done at the right time in the right direction by someone who had paid close enough attention to know which direction that was. Dex looked up from his sums. He had his father's way of going still before he spoke a brief internal gathering that had always made Hank seem more deliberate than he was. "Mama, if someone tried to take our land, could they?" She looked at him. 10 years old, doing arithmetic at night by lamplight, asking questions that told her exactly how much he'd understood of what was happening around him. She considered the softened version, the various ways adults protected children from the accurate shape of the world. Then she considered who Dex Greer was and who he was going to need to be. They could try. He held her gaze. But trying and succeeding are different problems. He went back to his sums. Outside, the wind had picked up from the northwest, carrying the particular note that meant the temperature was dropping through the night. The canvas on the outside woodpile would hold or it wouldn't. What was in the chamber below her floor would hold regardless, held by something the wind couldn't reach, 6 feet of earth-packed solid stable at 52 degrees, indifferent to everything happening above it. She banked the fire for the night, checked the children, went to the window, and looked out at the flat dark of the flint table. The first person to have tested her theory had tested it without telling her, and had written down that she was right. She didn't know that yet. She knew only what she could verify: the temperature in the chamber, the dryness of the wood, the warmth of the children sleeping above her. That was the full inventory of what mattered tonight. She pulled the curtain across the window and went to bed. January arrived the way it always did on the flint table, not as a calendar event, but as a physical fact, a hardening of everything that had been merely cold into something that had intention behind it. The sky in the first week of the new year sat low and white, the color of old bone, and the wind carried a fine crystalline snow that wasn't falling so much as being transported from one place to another, redeposited in long curved drifts against anything vertical enough to catch it. Willa's fence posts disappeared to their caps by the 6th. The outside woodpile, restacked under double canvas, weighted with stones she'd carried up from the dry creek bed in October, held against the first week's weather. She had developed a routine for the chamber, the way she developed routines for everything that mattered: systematic, repeated, documented. Each morning, she counted the stacked pieces, noted the temperature by feel. She had no thermometer, but 8 weeks of daily contact with the underground air had calibrated her sense of it to within a few degrees, noted whether any moisture had appeared on the walls or ceiling, whether the ventilation shaft was drawing properly. Each morning, the ledger entry was the same dry, stable drawing. She wrote it without satisfaction, because satisfaction was not the point. The point was the data accumulating, building into something that could answer a question she hadn't been asked yet, but knew was coming. She had developed a practice for the difficult nights, the ones when the spiral was available, the accumulated weight of the winter, the legal letters, the social isolation, the relentless arithmetic of fuel and food against one woman's resources, pressing towards some dark conclusion. The practice was this: she made a list, not of problems, of things she'd completed: the chamber, the bracing, the ventilation shaft, the door hinge she'd repaired in October, the 38 journal entries that were all the same 2 words: dry, stable. The list was not comfort, it was evidence. Evidence that the distance between a problem and its solution was almost always just labor applied in the right direction, sustained past the point where stopping felt reasonable. She did not spiral. Roy Calder came in the 2nd week of January, and something about him was different. Not dramatically, Roy Calder's face didn't do dramatic, but she noticed it the way she noticed most things without announcing that she'd noticed. He sat at the table with his coffee and looked at the trap door for a long moment before he spoke. The words came out with the quality of something that had been prepared. "I did something in November I didn't tell you about." She waited. He described the hole beside his barn, the 3 pieces of cottonwood, the 20 days, the comparison in the cold morning. She listened to all of it without interrupting, watching his face, reading the particular discomfort of a man who is honest by nature, carrying a small dishonesty longer than sits well with him. When he finished, she said, What did you find? You know what I found. I'd like to hear you say it. Roy looked at his coffee. He was a man who chose words the way he chose tools for fit, not for decoration. The wood from the hole was dry, burned faster, burned cleaner, held longer. By a margin I couldn't explain away. The silence between them had a particular quality not triumphant on her end, which surprised her a little. What she felt was something closer to relief, the specific relief of a person who has been holding a truth alone for a long time and has just watched someone else arrive at it independently. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Roy turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. Because if you were wrong, telling you I'd tested it would have felt like salt. Because if you were right, he stopped. I needed to be certain before I said so. I don't say things I'm not certain of. She thought about this. That's fair. Willa. He looked at her directly, and Roy Calder's direct look was a thing with some weight to it. You need to get someone with a thermometer down there, someone whose number people will believe. She thought about who. She understood that what was in the chamber was not yet a fact to the community, it was a widow's claim. Widow's claims required corroboration from someone whose word carried a weight that hers didn't, and she was clear-eyed enough about the world she lived in to recognize that as a condition rather than an injustice. You dressed for conditions. Let me think about who, she said. 2 days after Roy's visit, Silas Breck came back. She heard the horse first, a single rider moving slowly, not in haste. She went to the window and saw him dismounting at the fence, tying the horse with care, checking the knot twice. He came in without the ledger. That was the first thing she noticed. The small professional notebook he always carried was not in his coat pocket. He stood inside the door without moving further into the room and looked at the trap door for a moment before he looked at her. I'd like to go down again if you'll allow it. She stepped back from the door and gestured toward the trap door. He crossed the room and descended. He was down there longer than the first time, moving with a different quality, not the efficient survey of a professional making an assessment, but the slower examination of a person checking specific things against conclusions he'd already formed. She heard him press on the ceiling beams one by one. She heard him run his hands along the earth walls in sections. When he came back up, his expression was not the expression of the first visit. The hardness of a conclusion already reached was gone. In its place was something that looked like a man in the middle of a revision. The timber's holding better than I expected. The moisture level down there is lower than above-ground storage in comparable conditions. The ventilation is working. A pause that had some difficulty in it. The ductwork on the ventilation shaft is better than I would have specified. She poured hot water over the coffee grounds and handed him a cup. He took it. I made statements in December that were accurate assessments of potential risks. I did not account for the fact that you'd addressed those risks correctly. He held the cup without drinking. The cold sink concern was overstated. Cold air does sink, but the temperature differential between the chamber and the main floor is small enough that you're not losing meaningful heat from the house. The earth insulation maintains the chamber's equilibrium. I didn't account for that correctly the first time. She looked at him. He had driven an unknown distance after dark on a January evening to stand in her kitchen and say a version of the words I was wrong without using those specific words. She understood the cost of that for a man like Breck. I appreciate you coming out. He reached into his coat and set something on the table, a thermometer in a cast iron case, the kind built to withstand rough handling. Whatever temperature it reads down there, write it down. He put his hat back on. I'll want it back in spring. He left without more conversation, which was the Breck way. Willa stood at the table looking at the thermometer after the sound of his horse had faded into the dark. She picked it up, wrapped it in a cloth, carried it down into the chamber, placed it against the far wall away from the timber, where the air temperature was most representative of the space itself. She left it there and went back up. The next morning she descended with the lamp and read it 51 degrees. She wrote it in the ledger. She estimated the outside air temperature at 12 degrees, maybe 10. The difference between 10 degrees and 51 was not a number that required explanation. It explained itself. The week before the storm arrived, the weather did something the Flint table would remember afterward. As the storm's calling card, it moderated. 3 consecutive days of temperatures in the mid-20s, almost mild with light winds and clear skies. The particular deceptive comfort of a winter pause. People used those days freely. The Kellerman family brought their remaining hay under cover. Roy restacked his wood supply on fresh pallets. Mabel Hurst received a supply wagon from Caldwell and stocked her shelves. Willa spent those 3 days on final preparations. She had noticed a small section of wall near the northwest corner where the soil was sandier, less cohesive, and she'd been monitoring it for any sign of crumbling. During the moderate days, she mixed clay-heavy soil from deeper in the excavation with water and packed it against the sandy section, tamping it firm, letting it set. She brought down the last of her dry wood from the outside pile's protected bottom rows, filling the chamber to its practical capacity. She ran a final inspection of every beam, every joint, every inch of the ventilation shaft. She checked the thermometer 52 degrees. She wrote it down. On the evening of January 8th, Dex took the lamp to do his reading after supper. Louisa fell asleep in the chair near the stove, which she did sometimes, and Willa was covering her with a blanket when she heard the wind shift. It was a specific sound, not louder but different in pitch, like a string tuned higher on an instrument. The northwest wind had a particular register, and this wasn't it. This was a sound from further north, moving the air in a way that carried moisture and cold in the same breath. She straightened up and went to the window. The sky to the northwest had changed. In the remaining light, what had been pale blue had been replaced by something lower, the specific gray of a sky that had made a decision. The clouds were moving faster than the surface wind would suggest, which meant the system was large. She'd seen that sky once before in her life, the January before Hank died. That sky had looked exactly like this one. Dex appeared at her elbow. He'd heard the wind change too. He looked at the sky for a moment without speaking. Then, "Mama, what color is that sky? The color that means tomorrow we don't go outside." He went back to his reading without argument. She moved the sleeping Louisa to the bed upstairs, stoked the fire higher than usual to build a heat reserve in the walls. Checked the trap door, verified that the chain she'd put on the outside door in December was properly set. She went through the house with a different quality of attention, the way a sailor checks the rigging when the weather changes rather than when it's clear. Then she sat in Hank's chair and looked at the trap door and thought about Roy Calder's offer made casually in early December. If things got bad, there was room at his place. She thought about the 2 miles between their properties. 2 miles in a blizzard was not 2 miles. 2 miles in a blizzard was a geography lesson in how wrong distance calculations could be when visibility dropped to 10 feet. She'd known people who died within sight of their own doors, turned around in the white, walking in the wrong direction with perfect confidence. She sat in the chair and did not move. She thought about the chamber below her floor, the 52 degrees she'd written down that morning, the stacked wood against the far wall. She thought about the November night she'd sat at this same table with a piece of paper and calculated odds she'd then burned. She thought about the fact that she had built the thing she'd built, tested it the way she'd tested it, and that the gap between believing a thing would work and knowing it would work could only be crossed one way. She stayed. The storm arrived overnight, slipping in after dark when people were already inside and committed to their particular shelter. Willa woke at 2 in the morning to a sound that wasn't wind so much as pressure, the whole structure of the house flexing slightly against a force coming from the northwest that had been building since midnight. She lay still and listened, the roof holding, the north wall holding. The window fitted well enough that the draft was minimal. Below her through the floor, the chamber unchanged, stable, holding its 52 degrees regardless of what the world above it was doing. She got up, added wood to the fire, descended into the chamber to check the thermometer by lamplight. 51 degrees. She brought up 4 pieces of oak, closed the trap door, added 2 pieces to the fire set, 2 beside the stove for the morning. She went back to bed. By morning, it was unrecognizable outside. The south-facing window showed a wall of white moving horizontally. Dex stood at the window before breakfast, with the look of a boy who had imagined blizzards from other people's stories and was now encountering the version that generated those stories. Louisa, 7 years old, was unusually quiet, her response to things she didn't yet have a category for. Willa made breakfast from what she had inside and kept the fire high. The wood she brought up each time was exactly as it had been the first time, dry, patient, ready to catch. The fire burned cleanly, no smoke, no wrestling with fuel that didn't want to participate in its own combustion. 2 miles west, Roy Calder was fighting a different war. He would tell her about it later, and she would piece together the rest from what his face confirmed. His outdoor wood supply, stacked on new pallets but exposed to wind from the northwest, had drifted over by early morning. The snow had packed into the gaps between pieces and overnight had frozen solid, binding the top half of the pile into an interlocked mass that didn't come apart when he dug to it. He spent an hour in the storm breaking pieces free with an iron bar, carrying them inside, wet stacking them near the stove to thaw before burning. Wet wood into a cold stove was a particular kind of defeat. It took kindling to start it burned half its heat, creating steam rather than warmth, through smoke into a closed room. His interior temperature would later sit in the low 40s for the first 2 days. Louisa developed a fever on the second day. It came up gradually in the afternoon. Willa noticed the heat in her cheek during a hug the girl had initiated. Not high, not dangerous by itself, the kind of fever a body runs when it's fighting something small. But in a blizzard with no doctor within reach, a small fever required the same attention as a large one, because small fevers had the option of becoming large fevers given the right conditions. The right conditions in a Kansas winter were cold and damp, and Willa's house was neither. Her fire burned steadily on dry wood, the temperature holding at 63 degrees, a degree higher than her usual, while she sat near Louisa through the afternoon, and Dex read by the window with his lamp turned low to save oil. She descended into the chamber 6 times on the second day. Each time she came back up with dry wood, each descent reminded her of what was holding not just the temperature, but the system, the patient accumulation of small, correct decisions made over 8 weeks. She thought about Breck's first assessment, the warning about cold sink, the prediction about the timber. She was not angry thinking about it. He'd assessed risk based on what he knew. He hadn't known about the 52 degrees. He hadn't accounted for what the earth itself was willing to do if you asked it the right question. On the third night after the children were asleep and the storm was still moving outside, with no indication it was tiring, Willa sat alone in the main room with the fire banked lower than during the day. She was managing the wood supply across 4 days, not burning for comfort, but for survival temperature. And she understood the difference. The house was 59 degrees. Louisa's fever had not climbed. She lifted the trap door and looked down into the darkness of the tunnel. She held the lamp over the opening, watching the warm light fall down the angled slope into the chamber below. She sat at the edge of the opening, her feet on the first step of the tunnel, and in the silence of 2 in the morning, with the storm outside, and the children sleeping above, and the fire at her back, she felt the full weight of the question she had been living with since November press against her from the inside. Not whether the chamber worked. She knew it worked. The question was the one she hadn't let herself ask directly since she'd burned that piece of paper in early November, whether she was equal to the total weight of what she'd taken on. The land, the children, the lawyer's letter, the winter, the community's judgment. Whether the distance between the woman who had buried her husband in March and the woman sitting at the edge of a trap door in January alone at 2 in the morning in a blizzard had been traveled correctly. She sat at the edge for a long time. She did not descend. She didn't need to check the thermometer. She knew what it said. She sat with the opening with the dark below and the firelight behind with the quiet that was the specific quality of underground air rising into the room. And she waited. Upstairs, Louisa made a small sound in her sleep. Not distress, just presence, the particular sound of a child who is warm enough to dream. Willa turned her head toward the sound. She sat a moment more. Then she lowered the trap door gently and went to check on the girl. Louisa's forehead was cooler. Not entirely past it, but measurably cooler, moving in the right direction. Willa stood in the dark of the sleeping space with her hand on her daughter's back and felt the steady rhythm of breathing that was just breathing, uncomplicated by anything worse. She counted 3 full breaths, then she went back downstairs. The 4th day arrived lighter than the first 3. Not ended, the wind still running hard, but lighter in a way that suggested the system was exhausting itself. By noon, the horizontal snow had shifted to something actually falling rather than flying, and by mid-afternoon, the wind had dropped enough that the house no longer felt like it was being pushed from one side. By evening, the silence was almost startling, the specific, enormous silence of a plains winter, after a storm passes when the world is muffled under 2 feet of new snow and the wind has gone somewhere else. Willa opened the outside door at last light on the 13th. The drift against the north face of the house was chest high. The south side was more navigable. The outside woodpile's canvas was buried entirely a smooth white mound. She'd know what was underneath it tomorrow. Tonight she had what was in the chamber enough, which had been exactly what she'd calculated it would be when she'd started digging in November with the ground still workable and the whole idea still unproven. She stood in the doorway for a moment in the post-storm cold, which was brutal in its clarity. The stars were out in the way they only were after weather moved through, brilliant, covering the whole flat sky from one horizon to the other. She looked at them without particular sentiment, just looking the way a person looks at a very large thing after a period of looking at nothing but the immediate. Then she went inside, fed the fire its last good piece of oak for the night, checked the children wrote in the ledger day 4 chamber stable, 51 degrees storm, ended, closed the ledger, and slept. Roy Calder arrived on the morning of January 15th, 2 days after the storm broke. He came on horseback because the drifts made the wagon impossible. His horse picking its way along the high ground where the wind had scoured the snow thin. His coat was stiff at the shoulders. His face, when she opened the door, had the raw, simplified look of someone who had spent 4 days in a cold house. He didn't come in right away. He stood at the door and looked at her, reading something in her face or her posture. Then his eyes moved past her to the interior. The fire going clean, no smoke residue on the walls above the stove, the children at the table eating their breakfast, with the unhurried quality of people who had not spent 4 days in controlled emergency. He looked at all of this for a moment. Then he looked at the trap door. He crossed the room and crouched beside it without asking. He lifted it, held his hand over the opening, felt the temperature of the air rising from below. He lowered the trap door. He stood up. He looked at Willa with an expression she didn't immediately have a name for. Not quite disbelief, not quite vindication on her behalf. Something more private than either of those. His voice was quiet. How much did you burn? She went to the ledger. Roughly 14 pieces per day, 53 total across the 4 days. Roy was still for a moment. He looked at the stove, at the fire burning with the clean, even heat of dry wood catching properly. I burned everything I had. My full dry supply was gone by the end of the 2nd day. After that, I was pulling from the frozen pile, thawing pieces near the stove before I could use them. He stopped. I burned a chair on the 4th day. The number sat between them. 53 pieces against everything Roy had burned, plus a chair. She poured him coffee and set it on the table. He drank from it before he spoke again. That's not possible to argue with. Not with a straight face. He set the cup down. I need to see the thermometer. She lifted the trap door and preceded him down the tunnel, taking the lamp. They stood together in the chamber, unchanged in the way underground things were unchanged. The storm above having not touched this air, not entered this temperature. She held the lamp near the thermometer. Roy leaned in and read it. He straightened up. He turned and looked at the stacked wood, roughly 2/3 of what she'd stored, enough for another 10 days of careful use. He picked up a piece of split oak from the top of the stack. He held it in both hands, examining the weight and surface, the core temperature of it. He set it down. He was quiet for a long moment. In the underground quiet, his breathing was audible. Slow, the breathing of a man making a full accounting. I misjudged you, Roy Calder said. Not an apology. Roy Calder's character didn't organize itself around apology as a primary instrument. It was more precise than that. A correction of the record stated plainly by a man who believed that errors of judgment should be acknowledged with the same directness as the errors themselves. Not about the idea. I wasn't certain enough about the idea to have misjudged it. I misjudged your ability to execute it correctly alone in the time you had. That was wrong of me. She looked at him in the lamplight. You tested it yourself in November. I did, without telling me. I needed to know before I could say. I should have told you when I knew. She considered this. The underground air sat still around them. Roy, what you said when you knew, that single nod the morning after the storm, I understood it. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded again, once the same gesture, and it meant the same thing. It had meant the first time I see it. I understand it. It's real. Coming from Roy Calder, that was the full measure of endorsement available. They came back up into the main room. Roy stayed for 2 hours asking specific questions. The depth, the ceiling bracing, the ventilation shaft angle, the wall preparation, the tunnel's drainage during the storm. He wasn't building a case for or against. He was learning. She recognized the quality of his attention because it was the same quality she'd brought to the problem in October, the attention of a person who has decided that understanding the thing correctly is more important than being right about it quickly. Before he left, standing at the door with his coat on, Breck needs to bring his thermometer, not just for me, for everyone who's going to ask questions after I tell them what I saw down there. Breck already left his thermometer. That's what you read on the far wall. Roy absorbed this. A brief recalibration moved across his face. He came back. 2 weeks before the storm. What did he say? He said the ventilation was better than he would have specified. Roy put on his hat. At the door, turned half away, his voice carrying toward the fence line. 14 pieces a day, 53 total. Write that down somewhere you won't lose it. He mounted and rode west into the scoured white landscape, and Willa stood in the open doorway for a moment after he disappeared. She went inside and wrote it down. Silas Breck came 4 days later on the 19th. He didn't come alone. Roy Calder rode with him, and Edgar Hurst was with them, which was a fact of some significance. Edgar ran the store with the same pragmatic efficiency his wife applied to social architecture. And if he was riding out to the Greer place in January, it was because someone had told him something that made it worth the trip. There were two others, Clarence Boone from the eastern section, a farmer of about 50, who had the weathered patience of a man who'd been arguing with the Kansas climate for 20 years, and Fletcher Pratt, whose wife Bessie ran the cattle operation to the north. 5 men at her fence line on a January morning. Breck carried a different thermometer this time, a larger glass column version in a wooden case, the kind that gave a more precise reading. He also carried the small professional ledger he hadn't brought on his night visit, which told her this was a different kind of call. She let them in. The main room was at 63 degrees. The children were upstairs. Breck looked at the stove thermometer without comment. He looked at the trap door. He looked at Willa. May we? She opened the trap door. She preceded them down. 5 men descended into the chamber behind her, filling the underground space with their bulk, and she heard them going quiet as they reached the bottom and entered the room. The particular quiet of people adjusting to a space that was not what they expected. Edgar Hurst made a sound that was not quite a word. Clarence Boone crouched and pressed his palm to the earth floor. Fletcher Pratt looked at the stacked wood with simple, undisguised calculation. Breck went to the thermometer on the far wall. He read it, then placed his own instrument beside it and waited for it to settle. He had recorded the outside temperature before leaving his place that morning, 11 degrees Fahrenheit. He waited. The chamber waited with him. The glass column settled. Breck read it. He read it again. He turned to the room, Roy, Edgar, Clarence, Fletcher, all of them, in this underground space that smelled of earth and dry wood, and the particular mineral coolness of ground the frost had never reached. Breck's voice had the flat precision of a man who had decided that precision was the only thing he had left to offer that was worth offering. 52 degrees. Outside air is 11. The differential is 41 degrees, sustained through a 4-day blizzard with no additional heat source below ground. He looked at the stacked wood. He looked at Willa. Mrs. Greer maintained interior house temperature at 62 degrees using 14 pieces of dry wood per day. Comparable households in the district burned 2 to 3 times that quantity while maintaining lower interior temperatures. A shorter pause. The wood in this chamber is completely dry. My own above-ground storage took on moisture during the storm at a rate that reduced burn efficiency by my estimate of 30 to 40%. The chamber was very quiet. Edgar Hurst was looking at the wall of stacked wood with the expression of a merchant calculating. Clarence Boone had stood and was examining the ceiling beams. Fletcher Pratt was looking at nothing in particular, which meant he was looking at his own property, his own woodpile, his own situation mapped against the new information. Roy Calder wasn't looking at anything in the chamber. He was looking at Willa. She held the lamp steady. She had been in this room so many times by now that its dimensions and temperature were as familiar to her as the main room above. More familiar in a way, because she'd built it, had excavated every cubic foot of it with her own hands. Breck closed his ledger. He spoke to the room rather than to her specifically. Any family in this district that wants to survive the next 20 winters without burning furniture in January should come look at what this woman built. He put the ledger in his coat. He looked at Willa, once brief, direct, carrying the full acknowledgement in 2 seconds that he hadn't been able to put into words on his night visit. Then he turned and ascended the tunnel. The others followed. She came up last, lowered the trap door, turned to find 5 men standing in her kitchen looking at her with the various expressions of people who have had a fixed opinion substantially revised in a short period of time. Edgar Hurst was the first to speak. How long did the excavation take? 6 weeks, working in the margins of days. Alone. Dex helped with the bracing toward the end. Edgar looked at Roy. Clarence Boone said, addressing the middle distance in the way of a man thinking out loud, "I've got a south-facing hillside about 20 feet from my back door. Natural drainage slope. I've been looking at that hillside for 10 years. He stopped. I've been looking at it wrong. Fletcher Pratt was already at the door, pulling his coat straight with the focused energy of a man who has identified the next task. "I'll need to know the ventilation calculation, the shaft angle." He looked at Willa. "If you're willing. Come in spring when the ground is workable. I'll show you everything." They left in a group, mounting their horses at the fence line. She watched them from the window, 5 men riding back toward their various properties across the white landscape, each of them carrying a number. 52 degrees, 11 degrees, 14 pieces, 53 total. The numbers would travel faster than the men did, because that was how numbers traveled on the Flint table, by repetition, at the feed store at church, at every fence line conversation, until the number was common property separated from its origin, existing on its own terms. The letter from Aldrich and Croft arrived 6 days later on the 25th of January. It was shorter than the previous 2. It informed her in the measured language of lawyers delivering outcomes they find inconvenient that Warren Greer had determined not to pursue the matter of the deed review at this time. They remained her humble servants. She read it once. She put it in the drawer with the other 2. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the table. Then she got up and went outside to check the outside woodpile's condition now that the storm had been over for 12 days. The canvas had held on the south side. The bottom rows were fine. She began moving wood inside for the rest of January. She did not feel triumphant about the letter. Warren had calculated that a widow who could do what she'd done was not a widow. A Kansas court would rule against. That was a practical calculation, not a moral one, and she respected practical calculations even when they served her interests more than the person making them. What she felt was something quieter than triumph, the specific feeling of a weight carried so long, it had begun to seem like part of the body suddenly absent. Not gone entirely, but the immediate pressure, the particular weight of that specific threat was lifted. She stacked wood for 2 hours. It was enough. February came then. March, the Flint table doing what it always did when the season turned, changing. Not all at once, but in increments each day, marginally longer than the last. The snow receding from the south-facing slopes. First the grass showing through in patches of brown, then tentatively the first color of new growth underneath. The ground thawed from the surface down, which meant the chamber's temperature differential narrowed as the season progressed. The above-ground temperature climbing toward the underground temperature, until in late April they met somewhere around 54 degrees. The families that came to see the chamber in March and April were asking questions that went beyond firewood. The Kellermans came on a Saturday, all 4 of them. Mrs. Kellerman was interested in the wall preparation, Mr. Kellerman in the ceiling bracing. Before they left, he asked whether the principal would work for root vegetables for seed grain that needed protection from temperature extremes. Willis showed him the ledger, the full winter temperature record. He copied the relevant numbers carefully into his notebook. The Pratt family came 2 weeks later. Fletcher had already begun excavating his hillside. He came to ask about the ventilation shaft angle, the precise calculation she'd worked out by trial in November, and she walked him through it at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, showing him the geometry, the relationship between shaft length, angle, and draw rate. His wife Bessie sat across the table and wrote everything down in a hand clearer than her husband's, which Willa noted without comment. A freighter named Coleman Birch, who ran supply routes between the Flint Table District and the rail town south of Caldwell, came through in April with his wagon and heard the story from Edgar Hurst while loading supplies. He went to see the chamber himself, asked the right questions, spent 20 minutes below ground reading the thermometer and examining the construction. By June, he'd mentioned the technique to homesteaders in 4 different counties along his route. By autumn, variations of earth-sheltered firewood storage were appearing in regions 60 miles away. The freighter carried the idea the way water carried seeds, without intention, simply because it was moving and the idea was there to carry. Roy came in April with a proposal, a family new to the district arriving in May from Ohio. No experience with the specific demands of a Kansas winter. He'd told them about the chamber. They wanted to build one before their first winter. Would she speak with them? She said she would. Roy nodded, unsurprised. He had a way of asking questions whose answers he already knew. By May, the number of families who had visited or sent questions was 11. By June, 3 chambers were under construction within a 5-mile radius. Willa had not stood at any community gathering and explained her method. She had not written instructions or appointed herself the district's authority. She had answered the questions that came to her kitchen table, shown the ledger to anyone who asked, walked people through the chamber, and let the thermometer do its work. The technique spread the way things spread when they work quietly, practically because the alternative was chairs burned in blizzards and families half frozen behind fires that couldn't catch. Mabel Hurst came on a Tuesday in late May on foot, which meant she'd walk the 2 miles from town, which was not a casual gesture. She carried a basket of pie inside it, apple wrapped in a cloth. She stood in the doorway with the basket held in both hands and her face wearing the expression of a woman who had rehearsed something and arrived to find the rehearsal was insufficient preparation for the actual moment. She set the basket on the table. She looked at the trapdoor. She looked at Willa. Edgar wants to know how deep the chamber needs to be to maintain temperature in a building with a plank floor rather than a sod floor. Willa looked at the basket. She looked at Mabel. Sit down. Mabel sat. Willa poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from her. The plank floor changes the insulation calculation slightly. You'll want to go 7 feet rather than 6 to account for the additional heat bleed through wood versus sod. She pulled the ledger from the drawer. Here's the temperature differential across the full winter. You can see it stays within 3 degrees, regardless of above-ground conditions, once you're past 6 feet. At 7 feet, Edgar's store would maintain the same stability. Mabel wrote in a small notebook she'd produced from her coat pocket. When she finished, she looked up. Her voice was careful, carrying something inside it that existed in the narrow space between apology and its absence. It made a difference this winter, for people who built based on what they heard from you. I'm glad it worked for them. Mabel looked down at her notebook, then back up. I was unkind in November at the store. You were skeptical. That's different from unkind. Mabel looked at her for a moment with the expression of a woman recognizing a grace she hadn't quite earned. She looked at the ledger. May I copy the temperature records? Take the page. I've got the numbers in my head by now. Mabel took the page, folded it carefully, put it in her coat. She didn't stay long, which was right. Neither of them was built for extended reconciliation. When she left, Willa sat at the table with the pie and the empty cups and looked at the trap door. She thought about November, about standing at Mabel Hurst's counter and saying thank you, Mabel, to a room that had been waiting to see what she would do. She'd walked out and driven home and split wood for 2 hours. She'd done essentially the same thing today, sat at the table, answered the questions, given the information. The consistency of her own response across the distance of 6 months had a quality she recognized. Her mother had called it, without naming it, as a virtue, simply being the same person twice. The man from the Wichita Eagle arrived in June. His name was Aldous Webb, younger than she'd expected, with the particular energy of a journalist who has been told there's a story somewhere and has ridden out to find it. He'd heard the story from 3 different sources, and each had given him a slightly different version, which meant the truth was somewhere in the intersection and he'd come to find it. He sat at the kitchen table with a notebook larger than Mabel's and a pencil he sharpened twice during the conversation. He asked good questions. She answered them accurately without embellishment. He descended into the chamber, read the thermometer himself, examined the bracing, looked at the ventilation shaft. He came back up and wrote for several minutes without speaking. Then, who taught you the principle? Was there someone who showed you the concept first? Amos Pruitt. He was a well digger. He explained the frost line in passing while he was assessing this property in the spring of 1886. Webb wrote this down. Pruitt taught you. Pruitt mentioned a fact about subsurface temperature. I applied it. Webb looked up from his notebook. He was reading her face, looking for the version of the story that would travel better than the accurate one. Mrs. Greer, I'd like to write about this in a way people will understand and remember. A technique like this needs a name, needs an association someone readers can connect it to. Silas Breck is known across 3 counties. Roy Calder has been farming this district for 11 years. Either of them could. Mr. Webb, her voice was even, not cold. Breck verified the temperature. Calder helped me think through the question of timber selection. Neither of them built what's under my floor. She looked at him steadily. But you're right that it needs to be something people will use. Name it whatever you need to name it. Write it however it travels best. She folded her hands on the table. Just make sure you write down the depth. 6 feet minimum, 7 for plank floors. Make sure you write down the ventilation shaft angle. Make sure you write down that the walls need clay-heavy soil packed in sections, not sandy composition. If people build it wrong, it won't work, and a thing that doesn't work doesn't get passed on. She paused. The details matter more than the name. Webb looked at her for a long moment. He wrote something in his notebook, a longer passage than the question warranted. He underlined something. He closed the notebook. May I quote you on that last part? Quote whatever's useful. He rode back toward Wichita that afternoon. Roy brought her a copy of the Eagle 3 weeks later, folded to the relevant page. The headline named Breck. The body of the article described the chamber in accurate detail: depth ventilation, wall preparation, temperature differential. In the fourth paragraph, a single line: Mrs. W. Greer of Flint Table developed the technique independently in the winter of 1886, and her meticulous records provided the first systematic documentation of its effectiveness. Then the article moved on, and Willa's name did not appear again. She read it twice. She folded it and put it on the table. Roy was watching her from across the room with the careful attention he'd been giving her since January, the attention of a man who wanted to know what she felt about things, but understood that asking directly was not always the right instrument. She looked up from the paper. The depth is right. The ventilation angle is right. The wall preparation is right. Roy looked at the folded paper. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not a smile exactly, more the internal version of a smile, the kind that doesn't require the face to participate. Someone is going to read that article and go 6 feet in sandy soil without the clay packing. Probably. They'll come find you when it doesn't work. Probably. He picked up his coffee. Outside, through the open door, the June light lay long across the Flint Table green, with late spring grass, the sky open in all directions. The wind, its permanent self, but warmer now, carrying something that was almost permission. Dex was somewhere outside the sound of activity near the barn. He'd been asking Roy questions about fence building for 2 weeks, the methodical questions of a boy who was learning how to learn from people who knew things he didn't. The winter made its accounting known slowly in the months that followed, as families across the district tallied what the January storm had cost them against what it had cost Willa Greer. The math was not subtle. 3 families had burned through their entire wood supply and resorted to furniture and structural lumber. 2 others had maintained heat only by burning wet wood that produced a fraction of its potential warmth, filling their houses with smoke that left children coughing for weeks. Roy Calder's chair was not the only piece of furniture that fed a Kansas fire that January. It was just the one that had been admitted aloud. Against this one household on the Flint Table had burned 53 pieces of dry wood over 4 days, maintained 62 degrees, kept both children healthy, and emerged from the storm with 2/3 of its underground supply intact. The comparison required no advocate, no speech, no community meeting at which someone stood up and argued the case. The numbers argued themselves the way numbers do when they're true. Willa found Dex on a September evening near the south side of the house, crouched in the grass with a stick and a piece of paper drawing something. She stood beside him and looked down a cross-section diagram of the chamber, the tunnel, the ventilation shaft, the way they connected to the house above. His proportion was off on the tunnel angle, and the ceiling joists were too widely spaced in his drawing, but the principle was there: the relationship between the underground space and the surface, the logic of depth and temperature rendered in a 10-year-old's hand on a Kansas evening. She crouched beside him. She took the stick. She corrected the tunnel angle. She redrew the ceiling joist spacing. She handed the stick back. He studied the corrections, nodded once, the same gesture as Roy's, she noticed, which told her something about who the boy had been watching this past year, then began copying the corrected version onto his paper. Why does the angle matter? He didn't look up from his drawing. Wrong angle, wrong draw rate on the ventilation. Wrong draw rate, the air stagnates. Stagnant air builds moisture. Moisture is what you're trying to keep out. He wrote angle equals draw rate equals moisture in the margin of his paper. She looked at those 3 words for a moment, the compression of the principle into its essential relationship, and felt something that had no clean name. Not pride exactly, though that was part of it. Something more like recognition. The recognition of a thing you've made correctly capable of being passed on. By the spring of 1888, when the Flint Table had its second full winter behind it since Willa had dug the first chamber, the district counted 19 earth-sheltered storage rooms in active use within 10 miles of the Greer property. Some were underground sheds attached to existing structures. Some were hillside chambers like the one Roy had excavated in March 1887, wider than Willa's, with a timber door rather than a trapdoor entrance. The Kellerman family had incorporated theirs into a larger root cellar design, using the same principle across a bigger space to store grain, vegetables, seed stock, anything that needed stable temperature without warmth. Each version was different, adapted to specific terrain and available materials. None of them were called by Willa's name. The Eagle article had named Breck. Other conversations named Roy. Some people in the district didn't know where it had started at all. They'd heard it from a neighbor who'd heard it from another, and the origin had dissolved into the general body of practical knowledge that accumulated in a community over time, becoming simply what people did rather than what Willa Greer did. This was the nature of useful things. They shed their origins the way rivers shed the individual rainfalls that fed them. She had thought she would mind this more than she did. She'd expected a residue of something bitterness, the specific loneliness of having done something real that the record would not fully reflect. What she found instead was that it didn't carry the weight she'd anticipated. The ledger was in her drawer. The thermometer Breck had left her was on the chamber wall, still recording its daily truth. The wood in the chamber was accumulating through the summer months, next winter's supply arriving before next winter's demand. The 47 acres were hers. Dex was nearly 12 now in the spring of 1888, taller by 4 inches than he'd been the November she'd started digging, his voice beginning its uncertain transition, his father's stillness before speaking firmly established as his own. He'd spent the previous autumn helping a neighboring family build their earth-sheltered storage room. Not as her representative, not under her instruction at that point, but because the family had asked him specifically, having watched him work alongside her for 2 seasons. He was 11 years old, nearly 12, and a middle-aged farmer named Sutherland had asked him to oversee the ventilation shaft installation. She'd found them on a Saturday afternoon, the Sutherland farm 2 miles northeast Dex, in the excavated chamber below, calling up measurements Sutherland above ground, cutting the shaft angle on Dex's instruction. She'd stood at the lip of the excavation and watched without announcing herself. Sutherland was 43 years old, had farmed for 15 years, and was taking instruction from a boy who hadn't yet needed to shave. Sutherland wasn't doing it as a favor to the boy. He was doing it because the boy knew the angle, and Sutherland didn't. And on the flint table, what you knew mattered more than how old you were when you learned it. She'd walked home without interrupting them. That spring evening in 1888, Willa stood at the south side of her house in the long light that came late. Now the days lengthened back to something generous. Louisa was in the yard somewhere 8 years old, and conducting whatever private enterprise occupied her these days, her voice occasionally audible from behind the barn. Dex was visible near the fence line doing something with the post hole digger that looked like it might be preliminary measurement for something she hadn't been consulted about yet. Below her, through the floor of the house, she was standing beside 52 degrees of quiet patience. Above it, everything that required tending the fence. The fields, the children, the ledger in the drawer. The next winter already beginning its approach from somewhere north of them, already loaded with its cold intentions, already moving toward the flint table with the unhurried certainty of something that had always been coming. She looked at her 47 acres in the spring light, grass coming in strong on the south fields. The fence line Roy had helped her reset after the February freeze solid, now the post driven to the depth that didn't move. The barn that Hank had planned and she had finished, not the barn he'd imagined smaller built, with what she had rather than what he'd wanted, but sound tight, doing its work without complaint. She thought about the November morning she'd stood at the woodpile and looked at wet wood and started doing the math. She thought about the piece of paper she'd burned. She thought about the iron rod pressed into the earth at different depths, noting where resistance changed. She thought about 40 hours of digging in the margins of days that were already full in $11 in materials, and the specific quality of silence in an underground room at 52 degrees when the world above it was doing its worst. She thought about all of this the way you think about a road you've traveled, not with nostalgia, which required a kind of distance she didn't have from it yet, but with the recognition of someone who has arrived somewhere and is standing still long enough to understand that the arriving was not an accident. The work had been the point. The knowing what work to do and doing it in the right direction and not stopping before it was finished, that had been the point. Everything else was consequence. The sun moved on the flint table as it always did. Indifferent, generous, making no distinctions between the 47 acres that were hers and the acres beyond them that belonged to other people with other problems. The wind moved with it, carrying the smell of the spring grass, the distant sound of Louisa's voice, the small sounds of Dex working at the fence line. Willa Greer was 34 years old. She had two children who were warm 47 acres that were hers, a chamber below her floor that held its 52 degrees through whatever the world above it decided to do, and a ledger in the drawer with a winter's worth of entries that all said the same two words. She had buried her husband and outlasted his brother's lawyers and built something that 19 families were using and that freighters were carrying across 4 counties and that a journalist had written about in a newspaper that people read over breakfast in Wichita. She had not needed anyone to remember her name in connection with it. She had needed the depth to be right and the angle to be right and the walls to be packed with clay-heavy soil rather than sandy composition and the wood to be dry when January arrived with its intentions. It was, it was, it was, it was. She went inside to start supper, passing through the main room past the trapdoor with its leather hinges, past the stove with its thermometer above it, past the drawer that held 3 lawyers' letters, and a winter's worth of evidence past the ledger on the table. The fire wasn't lit a spring evening, not requiring it. The room held the day's warmth in its sod walls, which was what sod did held, what it had been given. Released it slowly made the inside a different country from the outside. That was all a house was supposed to do. That was all she had ever asked of any of it. She was equal to both the warmth inside and the cold that was always coming. She had proven this once. She would prove it again. That was not a burden. That was simply the nature of the work, and the work was hers, and she was not done with it yet, and she had no intention of being.